The city never truly slept. Neon signs buzzed and flickered above rust-stained buildings. Yellow buses weaved through traffic with angry horns, and vendors called out until their voices cracked. Yet, beneath this restless rhythm was another current, one too quiet for daylight chatter. It was the whisper of women who lowered their voices, the tremor in footsteps after dark, the knowledge that someone was hunting in the shadows. His name was John, a man whose presence was not loud but carried a chill that stilled conversations whenever he entered a street. John thrived in silence. He did not shout or display rage. He carried his cruelty in his cold gaze and in the unsettling curl of his lips that mimicked a smile but was only hunger dressed in charm. Those who encountered him described eyes that stripped away safety, leaving behind dread and confusion. The girls he preyed on returned changed, spirits fractured, their laughter replaced with quiet tears, their pride reduced to whispers of shame. No one dared to call his crime by its name. Yet the city knew. The fear in the women's eyes was evidence enough. The first story that reached the ears of Inspector Adewale came through Ngozi, a 21-year-old university student with dreams of law and justice. She was slim, with short curly hair framing her oval face, her brown eyes alive with ambition. One night, she entered a taxi near her campus, vanishing for days that stretched like eternity. When she returned, she was no longer the girl who spoke with fire in class debates. She walked slowly, her shoulders bent, her eyes cast downward. Her voice trembled as she whispered of a man who had stripped her dignity and left her hollow. Inspector Adewale sat in his dim office, the overhead fan squeaking with every spin, his desk buried under neglected files. His stocky frame leaned forward as he listened to Ngozi, mustache twitching while his weary eyes absorbed her pain. He had heard this pattern before. Different names, same silence, same shadow. Women feared speaking John's name, as though uttering it would bring him back, as though his power stretched beyond alleys into their very souls. Adewale scribbled notes, his pen heavy with frustration. He wanted justice, but he knew he was chasing a ghost shielded by fear. Amina entered, not as a victim, but as a friend who refused silence. She was 25, medium height, slim built, her braided hair falling neatly to her shoulders. Her brown skin glowed faintly under the neon lights, and her oval face carried eyes that blended kindness with a fire that refused to dim. She held Ngozi's trembling hands and felt the weight of her silence. Amina had always been gentle, but injustice sharpened her spirit. In a city content to bow to shadows, she stood taller. She vowed she would find answers, even if the truth came at a price. Mama Nkechi was the first to try and dissuade her. The old woman, frail and bent by years, tapped her cane against the cracked pavement as she warned Amina of the danger she was courting. Her wrinkled skin carried the weight of decades, her headscarf faded but neatly tied, her eyes sharp with the wisdom of survival. "Child," she said, her voice thick with caution, "this city swallows the brave. Silence is what has kept the rest alive." Yet, Amina could not accept silence. To her, every quiet night meant another girl lost, another voice stolen, another life shattered. The city wore two faces. By day, the markets buzzed with laughter, the scent of roasted corn mixing with exhaust fumes, children weaving between buses with carefree joy. But at night, the same streets transformed. Alleys whispered, windows shut early, footsteps quickened with unease. Amina stood at that divide, staring into the night's open mouth. She knew her search would take her into those shadows, into corners where fear lived. This was not only about John's cruelty, it was about the rot that allowed him to thrive. And with her first step forward, the hunt truly began. Amina began by retracing Ngozi's last known steps. The university gates were crowded with vendors selling meat pies, roasted plantain, and pirated phone cards. Students laughed in small groups, their backpacks heavy with books and dreams. Yet, in the corner of every laugh was unease. Eyes darted quickly at shadows, and whispers fell silent when the night was mentioned. Amina spoke to two classmates who recalled Ngozi entering a taxi. No one remembered the driver's face, but the car was dark blue, windows tinted, engine coughing with age. That detail, insignificant to some, became the first crack in the wall of silence. Inspector Adewale followed up on the taxi clue, tracing old records, but the files led to nothing but faded ink and lost paperwork. Corruption had eaten into the system, and every missing page was a shield for men like John. Adewale rubbed his temples, staring at the ceiling fan that squeaked in lazy circles. "He hides because we allow him to," he muttered. His phone rang. Another girl had returned home in tears, her silence screaming louder than her words. John was accelerating, feeding on fear. Adewale realized they were not longer chasing him. He was leading them deeper into his web. Her name was Bisi, only 19, with long braids dyed with faint golden tips. She had a bright smile once, the kind that lit up the small tailoring shop where she apprenticed. But when she returned after disappearing for 2 nights, she was a shell of that girl. Her hands trembled too much to hold a needle. Her voice cracked when customers asked simple questions. Amina visited her, kneeling beside her chair, asking nothing, just holding her hand. Bisi finally whispered, "He takes, and you can't fight him. He owns the night." The words echoed in Amina's chest like a curse. The more Amina listened, the clearer the pattern became. John did not choose randomly. He watched, studied, and waited. He targeted those alone, those trusting enough to step into shadows without suspicion. His charm was his weapon, an easy smile, polite words, promises of safety that turned into chains of fear. Every girl described the same contradiction. He looked like a man anyone could trust, yet in his eyes was an emptiness that swallowed reason. Amina realized she needed to understand him not as a monster in the dark, but as a predator who wore the mask of normality. Mama Nkechi watched Amina grow more restless with each discovery. Her old woman's cane tapped like a drumbeat of warning, her voice heavy with memory. She spoke of a time long ago when men like John were whispered about, not punished. "This city protects its demons," she said. "If you go too deep, you may find not just him, but the ones who keep him safe." Amina's jaw tightened, but she could not retreat. If silence had protected John, then perhaps noise, loud and undeniable, could bring him down. She promised herself she would not let fear seal another mouth. The third girl Amina met was Halima, 22, tall with round face and wide, curious eyes. She sold roasted corn at a busy junction, her laughter once louder than the bus horns. But after her encounter with John, she laughed no more. Her mother whispered to Amina that Halima refused to leave the house at night, terrified of footsteps, terrified of her own shadow. When Amina spoke to her, Halima stared at the floor, her hands twisting the hem of her skirt. She whispered, "He watches first. Even when you think you're safe, he is already there." By the time Amina left Halima's home, her resolve had hardened like iron. Each girl's story was different, but the pain carried the same fingerprints. The city had learned to look away, but Amina would not. She wrote down every detail in a worn notebook, descriptions of the taxi, times of disappearance, streets where shadows grew too thick.
Inspector Adewale, though burdened, saw in her determination something he had lost years ago. Together, they began to piece fragments into a picture, not yet whole, but clear enough to know one thing. John was not invincible. He could be haunted. The streets told their own story if one listened carefully. Amina began spending nights wandering corners where fear lived. She lingered by bus stops where drivers argued over fares, near dim alleys where generators hummed and shadows swallowed whole figures. She noticed women walked in twos or threes, rarely alone, clutching bags close to their chests. Vendors packed early, leaving silence to echo against walls painted with graffiti and political posters. Amina realized that John's power was not only in what he did, but in how he shaped the entire rhythm of the city. Even those untouched walked under his shadow. Inspector Adewale pushed deeper into his investigation, though resistance met him at every turn. Colleagues hinted he should let the case rest, that some battles were unwinnable. But Adewale was stubborn. His wary eyes had seen too many victims turn into statistics. One evening, he gathered Amina in his office, showing her a map pinned with colored markers, each representing a girl who had fallen prey. The pattern was undeniable. John's movements were like a predator, circling the same hunting grounds. The inspector's voice was heavy. He knows the streets better than us, but if he follows a pattern, we can break it. The fourth girl to speak was Ifeoma, 20, small in stature, with wide, alert eyes and short braided hair. She had been walking home from evening church service when she vanished. Her friends found her days later, sitting at the back pew, rocking herself gently, unable to explain where she had been. When Amina approached her, Ifeoma barely whispered. He smiles before he destroys. He talks like he cares. Then the mask falls. The words cut Amina like a blade. John's weapon was not just strength, it was deception, the false comfort of trust that dissolved into terror. Amina recorded every girl's story in her notebook, pages filled with names, ages, and patterns. She saw how John moved through the city like smoke, slipping into gaps of trust, vanishing before morning light. But each victim's memory held pieces of him. The cold tone of his voice, the confident way he carried himself, the faint cologne he wore. Together, they formed a ghostly portrait. Amina shared her notes with Adewale, who studied them with furrowed brows. "She is not untouchable," she said firmly. For the first time, Adewale saw not just a victim's friend, but a fighter the city desperately needed. John himself remained a phantom, moving unseen but leaving dread in his wake. At night, he strolled confidently through alleyways, his fitted black shirt blending into shadows, his sharp jawline and cold eyes scanning potential prey. He knew the fear he created was more powerful than any weapon. Women avoided his gaze, yet he thrived on that silence. In his mind, the city belonged to him. It feared his crown. The arrogance in his stride was the arrogance of a man who believed he could never be caught. To him, the streets were not dangerous, they were his kingdom. But kingdoms eventually rot. One night, Amina sat with Mama Nkechi, listening as the old woman told tales of other predators the city had once harbored. Some disappeared mysteriously, others were dragged into the open when courage outweighed fear. Mama Nkechi said, "Men like him feed on silence. When silence ends, their reign collapses." Amina clenched her fists, knowing she had no choice but to speak louder, push harder, and bring light into the corners John controlled. The old woman's cane tapped the floor like a drumbeat of courage, each strike echoing in Amina's heart. Armed with her notebook and Adewale's map, Amina began to form a plan. She identified areas where John often prowled and convinced Adewale to assign discreet patrols. It was risky. John was clever, and failure could cost lives. Yet every step closer felt like breaking chains that had bound the city for too long. Amina knew the danger. She was not blind. But her courage grew not from recklessness, but from the stories of Ngozi, Bisi, Halima, and Ifeoma. Their pain had become her fuel, and she vowed she would not rest until the predator who ruled the night was dragged into the light. The trap began with whispers. Adewale planted plainclothes officers across key corners. Men and women blending in as commuters, vendors, or late-night wanderers. Amina volunteered to be part of it, despite Adewale's protests. "You are not trained for this," he warned, but she met his gaze with fire. "Neither were they," she replied, pointing to her notes of the girls who had been hurt. In the end, he relented, though his worry showed. That night, Amina dressed simply. A loose blouse, worn jeans, and flat shoes, blending in with the city's evening crowd, but her eyes scanned every shadow. John had no idea the net was tightening. That evening, he moved with his usual confidence, strolling near a bus park where tired workers returned home. His sharp eyes settled on Amina, who appeared to him as another easy mark. He adjusted his black shirt and stepped closer, wearing the disarming half-smile he often used to lure. Amina's heart pounded, but she forced her hands to remain steady at her sides. Adewale's instructions echoed in her ears. "Don't break cover too soon. Let him expose himself." Every second stretched like an eternity as the predator drew near his bait. John spoke first, his tone soft and coaxing, designed to sound safe. "It's late," he said smoothly. "Let me walk you home." Amina tilted her head, pretending hesitation, as though torn between fear and trust. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "I can protect you from men who lurk around here." The irony made her stomach twist, but she kept her face calm. From the corner of her eye, she saw Adewale's signal, a brief nod from across the street. The game had begun, and for the first time, John was no longer in control of the stage he thought was his. As they walked, John steered Amina towards a narrow alley, his preferred hunting ground. The alley was lined with cracked walls, broken bottles, and faint graffiti, a place where sounds seemed to vanish. But this time, hidden eyes followed. A plainclothes officer leaned casually against a wall, another loitered near a kiosk, both ready to move. Amina's pulse hammered in her chest, yet she forced her steps to remain even. When John reached for her wrist, his grip tightening with the first sign of control, Amina lifted her chin slightly, the agreed signal. Shadows stirred, and the hunters closed in. The sudden movement caught John off guard. Within seconds, 2 officers sprang forward, gripping his arms. He twisted violently, his strength surprising even trained men. Bottles clattered as he shoved one officer back, his eyes flashing with fury. For a moment, the predator almost slipped free, his arrogance feeding his resistance. But Adewale himself rushed in, his voice booming through the alley. "Enough!" He swung his baton, striking John's forearm and loosening his grip. Amina stumbled back, breathless, watching the man who had haunted the city finally face a wall stronger than his terror. Even restrained, John fought like a cornered animal, his eyes wild, spitting curses at those who held him. The officers pressed him against the cracked wall, iron cuffs clinking as they finally locked around his wrists. The noise of the struggle drew residents from nearby apartments. Windows slid open, heads peeked out, murmurs filled the night. For years, fear had silenced them. Now they saw the source of that fear, dragged into the open, powerless. Amina felt tears sting her eyes, not from weakness, but from the relief of witnessing the end of a reign that seemed untouchable. As the police van's doors slammed shut on John, the city exhaled. It wasn't victory yet. Adewale reminded Amina that trials and evidence would follow, but this was the turning point. The predator was no longer in shadows. He was chained, visible, and stripped of his crown. Amina glanced at her notebook, pages filled with pain and resilience. She promised herself the stories of Ngozi, Bisi, Halima, and Ifeoma would not be forgotten. Their voices had led to this night. As the van drove off, Amina knew the city's streets would never be the same again. The silence had finally been broken. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled with faces hungry for justice. Journalists scribbled notes, while cameras flashed, capturing the moment the city's nightmare was placed under glaring lights. John stood in the dock, his once arrogant shoulders slightly hunched, his black shirt replaced by the dull uniform of prisoners. Amina sat in the front row, flanked by survivors who now carried themselves with quiet strength. Their eyes did not waver when John's cold stare searched the room, seeking cracks of fear. For the first time, it was he who was exposed, naked in shame. Ngozi was the first to testify. Her voice trembled at the start, but steadied as she spoke of the night her freedom was stripped away. She described the lies, the false kindness, the grip that turned her dreams into nightmares. Gasps rippled through the courtroom, but she pressed on, each word reclaiming the voice she had once lost. Amina scribbled her words, her notebook filling with testimony that the city would never again be able to deny. John shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening with each detail that cut through his facade of control. Then came Bisi, followed by Halima and Ifeoma, each with her own story of night stolen and dignity bruised. The women described the same pattern, the charming approach, the sudden grip, the threats whispered into the dark. Their courage filled the room, a tide that rose higher with every testimony. For years, silence had been their prison. Today, their words shattered its walls. Even the judge leaned forward, his stern face betraying flashes of human emotion as he listened. Amina could almost feel the city itself listening too, its heartbeat syncing with the rhythm of survival and truth. Adewale's testimony came last. He described the investigation, the courage of the victims, and the trap that finally ended John's terror. His voice was steady, but his words carried weight, echoing through the courtroom with authority. This city was not built for fear, he declared, pointing toward the dock, and no man is above its laws. The silence afterward was heavy, filled with the gravity of truth. For once, John looked small, dwarfed not by physical force, but by the collective voices raised against him. The predator was caged, and his reign was unraveling. When the judge finally delivered the verdict, the room held its breath. Guilty. The word fell like thunder, followed by the heavy sentence that ensured John would never again walk the city streets as a free man. Murmurs rose, then applause, restrained at first, spalling into a wave. Some survivors wept quietly, others smiled through tears. Amina closed her notebook, her pen resting at last. Justice did not erase what had been endured, but it carved a new chapter, one where silence no longer ruled and the city's daughters stood taller. Outside the courthouse, the air buzzed with noise. Reporters rushed with microphones, citizens shouted praises to the victims' bravery, and cameras flashed endlessly. Amina stood at the steps with Ngozi, Bisi, Halima, and Ifeoma, their hands briefly joined in solidarity. "We spoke," she whispered, her eyes glistening, "and they listened." The city seemed brighter, its chaotic streets no longer overshadowed by one man's darkness. Adewale joined them, nodding quietly before slipping back into the crowd, his job done, but his heart marked by what had unfolded. That night, Amina sat by her window, city lights flickering in the distance. Her notebook lay open on her lap, filled with names, testimonies, and truths that would outlive fear. She whispered a silent vow to continue telling the stories of women who dared to be heard. The city outside roared with traffic, laughter, and life, but beneath it all was something new, a current of defiance and strength. The silence had been broken, and though scars remained, the future no longer belonged to fear.